Morning, everybody. Well, God's got a sense of humour. Before I read you, I'm going to tell you a story. We went on Friday. I took Friday off of work, and Mary and I went to, Mary and my wife, we went to Hatch End to a restaurant. And we sat down and we had a nice meal. We thought we'd better go for a walk around just to walk the meal off. And Mary said to me, "Oh, you need to get your hair cut." And I thought, "Oh, okay." And I went in the barber's and I said, "How shall I have it done?" She said, "Short." And he did it real short. So God's got a sense of humour. He changed the weather. Right, the reading for today is, it's your name, John. Yes. John 5, verses 1 to 16. John 5, verses 1 to 16. Welcome all our visitors, buddy. After this, there was the feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is at Jerusalem, by the sheep market, a pool, which is called in the Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of impotent folk, of blind, halt, withered, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain season into the pool, and troubled the water. Whosoever then, first after the troubling of the water, stepped in, was made whole of whatsoever disease he had. And a certain man was there, which had an infirmity 38 years he had an infirmity. When Jesus saw him lie, and knew that he had been now a long time in that case, he saith unto him, "Wilt thou be made whole?" The impotent man answered, "Sir, I have no man, when the water is troubled, to put me into the pool, but while I am coming, another step down before me." Jesus saith unto him, "Rise, take up thy bed and walk." And immediately the man was made whole, and took up his bed and walked. And on the same day was the Sabbath. The Jews therefore said unto him that was cured, "It is the Sabbath day. It is not lawful for thee to carry thy bed." He answered them, "He that made me whole, the same, and said unto me, Take up thy bed and walk." Then asked they him, "What man is that which said unto thee, Take up thy bed and walk?" And he that was healed wist not who knew who it was. Wist is like knew. Wist not what it was. For Jesus had conveyed himself away, and gone away into the multitude in that place. Afterwards Jesus findeth him in the temple, and said unto him, "Behold, thou art made whole. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come unto thee." The man departed, and told the Jews that it was Jesus which had made him whole. And therefore did the Jews persecute Jesus, and sought to slay him, because he had done these things on the Sabbath day.
Well, good morning everyone. It's good to be here, good to be with you today, and we welcome all of those of you who are visiting with us today. We're glad to have you with us. In John chapter 5 and verse 6, Jesus asks a sick man what on the face of it seems a strange question. Do you want to be healed? This man has been an invalid for 38 years, and yet Jesus asked him, do you want to be healed? Why ask such a question when the answer seems so obvious? Surely anyone suffering from a long-term illness which affects their way of life would want to be healed. However, when we think about it for a moment, it's not such a strange question after all. To be asked, do you want to be healed, is really to ask, are you prepared to make the changes necessary for this to happen? And are you prepared for the consequences that would follow from being healed? When some thought about it, they might say, well, no, actually I'm quite content to stay as I am. I'm happy for others to take care of me. So in John chapter 5 and verse 6, Jesus asked the man the question, do you want to be healed? Because he wanted him to focus upon what he really wanted from his life. If Jesus were to heal him, then this would have great implications for his life. And was he prepared for that? Or was he content to stay in his present condition, which he was familiar with and in which he was comfortable? John describes the setting for this miracle by telling us that Jesus had gone up to Jerusalem at the time of one of the Jewish feasts. We're not told which feast it was. It could be Passover or Pentecost or Tabernacles. John doesn't tell us, but it was one of those feasts. And in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, that is the gate through which the sheep would be brought in for sacrifice at the temple, there was a pool. Depending on which version you're reading, it will have a different name. In some versions it's called Bethsaida or Bethesda or Bethzatha. And this pool is described as having 5 porticos or porches or covered alcoves. And these porches provided a basic shelter where there lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame and paralysed. This must have been a well-known place in Jerusalem where the sick and the infirm would gather. And they gathered at this pool because they believed that the water there had healing properties. Now, the last part of verse 3 and all of verse 4 is not included in the more modern versions of the New Testament. So in the version you're reading, you may have, as Adrian was reading it, you may have noticed that he was reading some things which weren't in your version. But you may find them in a footnote, the Revised Standard Version and the New International Version, but they are found in the Authorised Version, which I think Adrian was reading from. And those verses explain to us why the sick were gathered at this pool. We're told they were waiting for the moving of the water, for an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and troubled the water. Whoever stepped in first after the troubling of the water was healed of whatever disease he had. And whilst the evidence of the manuscript suggests that these words were not part of John's original writing, they do provide us with an ancient explanation as to the reason why the sick people gathered at this pool. This pool was supplied by water from an underground spring, and every so often the water would bubble up. And the people believed that when they saw this happening, an angel had come down and started stirring up the waters, and then whoever got into the water first, after this had happened, would be the one who was healed. And so it was to this place that Jesus came on this occasion when he was in Jerusalem. And it must have been a sad, pitiful sight to see so many sick people gathered there in one place, all hoping for a miracle which would heal them of their ailments. And there must have been many who left there disappointed. Likewise today, people who are desperate for healing or relief from suffering turn perhaps to alternative forms of treatment for a cure. They may visit shrines such as the one at Lourdes in France, or they go and see faith healers, or they try out traditional medicines which are untested and unproved. And thousands are left disappointed when they do not work. And when Jesus came to the pool, there were many there who were sick, who he could have healed. Yet Jesus focused his attention upon just one unnamed man. We're not even told the name of this man. Of all the people who Jesus could have healed, he chose to heal this one man who had been ill for 38 years. Perhaps this man's case was the most hopeless and desperate, which moved Jesus to have compassion upon him. In verse 6, John says that Jesus saw him and knew that he had been lying there a long time. In John chapter 2, verse 25, we're told that Jesus knew all men and needed no one to bear witness of man, for he himself knew what was in man. So although Jesus had perhaps never set eyes on this man before, he knew him. Jesus did not need to be told about this man's condition. He just knew what it was. And he knows that the man has been lying there for a long time, hoping for a cure. And Jesus then spoke to the man and he asked him that question. Do you want to be healed? And then the question seems so strange to us because the answer seems so obvious. Surely the man wants to be healed. That's why he's there at the pool, isn't it? It's like going into the doctor's surgery and seeing the people sitting around, and we say to them, do you want to get well? Well, why do you think I'm here in the waiting room? Of course I want to get well. But however strange the question may seem to us, it causes this man to focus upon his own condition, and it gets him to think about the consequences for his life should he be healed. If he is healed, then he will have the responsibility of looking after himself. Currently he is marginalised. He is on the outer edge of society. He's an outcast. He probably supports himself by begging. But if he is healed, then he will have to go out and get a job and work. Perhaps he's become comfortable in his present condition. For 38 years, others have looked after him, tending to his needs and supporting him. If he's healed, then this will all change. And so the question is designed, I think, to cause the man to reflect upon the consequences to come if he is healed. And furthermore, the question reminds the man of his own inability to deliver himself from his present condition. That he has been ill for 38 years, and there's little chance of this ever changing. The man does not answer Jesus' question directly. He doesn't say, yes, I do want to be healed. But instead he gives an explanation as to why he has not been healed. In verse 7 he says to Jesus, Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is troubled. And while I am going, another steps down before me. So when the water in the pool starts bubbling up, there's this mad rush to get into the water first. And someone else always gets there before him because he is too slow. Again, to draw the analogy with doctor's surgery, it's like phoning up your GP for an appointment in the morning, and you're put on, you listen to the message, your call is important to us, you're number 25 in the queue. There's always someone ahead of you in the queue. Well, this was the problem for this man too. There was always someone ahead of him in the queue to get into the water. And here's the irony of this situation, that the pool is meant to help the sick and the weak, but it's only the strongest and the quickest who get into the water first. So those like this man who are not quick and strong are still left in a hopeless and helpless condition. So perhaps he hoped that Jesus would be kind enough to stay around long enough to help him to get into the water when it started bubbling up. Perhaps that would be about the most he could expect from this. Well, Jesus does not make any comment on the popular superstition that this water had healing properties when it bubbled up. Instead, he simply says to the man, "Rise, take up your pallet and walk." Well, these words challenged the man's faith when he had just confessed to the hopelessness of his situation. He said, "I have no one to help me to get into the water." Jesus says, "Forget about the water. Just get up, pick up your bed and walk." For 38 years, the water in the pool had not been able to heal this man. But now Jesus is able to give him a different type of water, living water, which will heal him. The man must have perhaps sensed that there was something about Jesus in the way that he had said this, that there was an air of authority in his words, and so he did as Jesus commanded him. Verse 9 says, "And at once the man was healed, and he took up his pallet and walked." Christ had the power to heal this man immediately and completely. And the man had the will and the faith to obey Jesus. The man sensed in his body that healing had taken place, that he was able to get up and he was able to walk. But this is not the end of the story. There's a sequel. And John tells us an important detail in verse 9, that this incident happened on the Sabbath day, which explains what happens next. As the man is walking away and carrying his bed, he is challenged by some of the Jewish leaders, the religious authorities. Verse 10, John says, "So the Jews said to the man who was cured, 'It is the Sabbath. It's not lawful for you to carry your pallet. And whilst God had set aside the Sabbath as a day of rest on which no work was to be done, the Jews had superimposed their own regulations on that law, and they had identified 39 different activities which they regarded as work and were therefore prohibited on the Sabbath. They spent a long time trying to define what was allowed and what wasn't allowed on the Sabbath. And carrying your bed on the Sabbath was one of those things that they said you were not allowed to do. These man-made rules and regulations meant that the Jews had really lost sight of God's real purpose in giving them the Sabbath, which was intended for the benefit of mankind and not to be some sort of burden to them. The man who Jesus has healed was challenged then because he was carrying his bed on the Sabbath day, and therefore, according to them, he was breaking the law. But in his defence, the man answered the Jews in verse 11. He says, "The man who healed me said to me, 'Take up your pallet and walk.'" We may view the man's reply here in two ways. Either he is trying to put the blame on Jesus and get himself off the hook, or he's expressing his belief that someone who has the power to heal him would also have the authority to override any Sabbath restriction. The man who had been ill for 38 years, so when Jesus comes along and heals him and commands him to take up his bed and walk, the man is not going to argue with that. He'll just do as he's told, even if that means breaking a Sabbath regulation. Well, the Jewish authorities were not the slightest bit interested in hearing that this man had been ill for 38 years and has now been healed. They failed to see this as an occasion for rejoicing, a time to be happy. All they were concerned about was that someone had told this man to do something which contravened the Sabbath rules. And so they asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your pallet and walk'?" Not, "Who is the man who healed you? Who's the man who told you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" And the authorities showed their narrow-mindedness in that all that they were interested in was finding out the identity of this man who is going around telling people to break the Sabbath rules. The man who had been healed, though, could not tell the authorities who it was who had healed him. He didn't know, because Jesus had quietly slipped away into the crowd, as verse 13 tells us. Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn as there was a crowd in the place. Jesus was not doing this for any personal attention. He did what he did, and then he slipped away, disappearing from the scene. And even though the man did not know the identity of Jesus, he could at least have testified to them of what Jesus had done for him. But instead he seems reluctant to say anything. And so that initial faith that he had displayed when he obeyed Jesus' words to get up and walk seems now to have stalled. Well, Jesus later found the man in the temple. Jesus seeks out the man because he's not finished with him yet. And it's interesting that Jesus finds the man in the temple because in his previous condition as an invalid, he would not have been allowed to go in the temple to worship. So perhaps he's gone there now to praise God, to thank God for his healing. On finding the man in the temple, Jesus said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse befall you." Jesus had healed this man of his physical ailment. But Jesus is also concerned about the man's spiritual condition. And so he now seeks to address that too. Jesus is concerned about the whole person, the body and the soul. In saying to him, "Sin no more, that nothing worse befall you," we're not to necessarily conclude that the man's illness had been caused by some sin that he had committed in the past. But rather, Jesus is addressing his present condition and telling him not to continue in a life of sin. The man's physical health has been restored, And now he must seek spiritual restoration by turning away from sin, from a sinful life. By healing the man, and now by talking to him about his sin, then, Jesus is seeking from him an expression of belief or faith from this man. But none is forthcoming. Instead of expressing a belief in Jesus, the man then went away and told the Jewish authorities that it was Jesus who healed him. After their meeting in the temple, the man now knew the identity of Jesus, this man who had told him to take up his pallet and walk. And so he went and he told the authorities. Why did he do it? Hard perhaps to understand the man's motive in doing this. It seems almost ungrateful. Perhaps he did it out of fear, in order to try to clear himself, that if he could tell them who it was who told him to break the Sabbath, then perhaps they would let him off and excuse him. Or perhaps he began to resent Jesus talking to him about his sin. Maybe he did it out of spite. We don't really know. Whatever the man's reasons may have been, his actions caused trouble for Jesus. But there were repercussions, as verse 16 says, and this was why the Jews persecuted Jesus, because he did this on the Sabbath. The authorities now knew the identity of Jesus, and they began their opposition and their persecution of him because he broke their Sabbath rules. And this was an issue that would occur time and time again in the ministry of Jesus. This incident teaches us a number of lessons. From it we learn of Jesus' knowledge of everyone. He knew the condition of this man at the pool. And so he knows each one of us as well, personally and intimately. He knows what our needs are. He knows what our struggles are, just as he knew the condition of that man. And so he knows us. We learn also from this of the power and the authority of Jesus, that simply by speaking a word, Jesus could heal the sick, and his healings were immediate and they were complete. And we also learn of Jesus' concern for the whole person. He healed the man of his physical disability, but he was also concerned about the man's spiritual condition, and so he told him to sin no more. The sin would have a far more devastating effect on this man than his physical illness, and so it needs to be dealt with too. And of course, the same is true for us as well. That problem of sin has to be dealt with in our own lives. Although the man was healed of a condition which had debilitated him for 38 years, the story does not really have a happy ending. The man's response to Jesus is ambiguous, it's inadequate, it's inappropriate. There's no expression of faith or belief in Jesus on his part. Instead, there is what may be regarded as a betrayal of Jesus. And so his response to Jesus is, in a way, a sort of negative example for us of what must be avoided. But this is not how we are to respond to Jesus. At the conclusion of his gospel in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, John explains to us why he has recorded these signs. And John calls the miracles that he records, he always calls them signs. They're signs because they point to something. He says there, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. The man himself experienced the miracle of healing, but he did not come to faith in Jesus. And many today would seek the benefits that come from association with Jesus, but they don't really want to make that commitment that Jesus requires of us. This man did not see the sign pointing to Jesus as the Christ. But although the man did not respond, John has recorded the sign, so that later those like us who do read it will come to believe that Jesus is the Christ. This is perhaps an example of how we are not to respond. If we are already believers, then this story will strengthen our faith in Jesus. If we're not believers, then this story is presented to us as evidence of the identity of Jesus, that he is the Christ, he is the Son of God. And if we make that appropriate response of faith to him, then we shall have life in his name. Thank you.